It's my honor to introduce the first paper. Professor Jacqueline Kunkel is an adjunct professor of English at Butler Community College and an early career researcher. Her research focuses on the slasher film, The Final Girl, and gender roles within horror. She holds a master's degree in publishing from the George Washington University and her bachelor's in communications and English from Penn State University. She's co-founder of the travel blog Postcard Press and co-host of the horror blog and community Real Horror Show. She's also the creator and editor of the zine Combating Censorship, as well as an editor and author of poetry and fiction. So she's going to present her paper, Virgins Never Die, How Patriarchal Ideology Created the Most Important Trait of the Final Girl.
Thank you very much, Eric, and I hope my audio is okay. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Right. So good morning and thank you for attending my presentation. The title of my presentation is Virgins Never Die, How Patriarchal Ideology Created the Most Important Trait of the Final Girl. So to begin, I'd like to share a clip from the horror movie rules from the film Scream.
That's why she always outsmarted the killer in the big chase scene at the end. Only virgins can do that. Don't you know the rules? What rules? You don't... Jesus Christ, you don't know the rules?
Have an aneurysm, why don't you?
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie. For instance, number 1, you can never have sex. Big no-no! Big no!
I'm a dead man.
Sex equals death, okay? Number 2, you can never drink or do drugs. No, the sin factor. It's a sin. It's an extension of number 1. And number 3, never, ever, ever, under any circumstances, say, I'll be right back. Because you won't be back.
I'm getting another beer. You want one?
Yeah, sure.
I'll be right back.
You see, you push the laws and you end up dead. Okay, I'll see you in the kitchen.
Now that we're up to speed, this presentation will cover the following main points: the trope of the final girl, adaptation of female gender roles in slasher films, and finally, the history of patriarchal ideology using cinema as an influencer. Let us begin with some background and introductory information. Slasher films traditionally follow a preset equation and have particular tropes that are used to set apart the subgenre of horror film. We have the mass serial killer stalk and kill a group of teenagers, partying, drinking, sex, but most importantly, we have the one who doesn't die. The term final girl was first coined by Carol Clover in her book Men, Women, and Chainsaws, making it a household name used for any female character who is still alive by the end of the movie. This protagonist is special, set apart for her female counterparts because of one thing: her virginity. The final girl trope occurs again and again in modern and postmodern slasher films, so repetitive that it is canon and can always be anticipated, and yet brings about questions of gender roles in these slasher films. 2 truths have been uncovered about the slasher film: that having sex leads to a very short life, and final girls are upholding gender roles with their virgin status. The trope of the final girl is coupled with the ideology of sex before marriage being punished with death, while the virgin stays alive, rewarded in the eyes of the viewer for avoiding sexual promiscuity. Reasoning behind the final girl being virginal is influenced directly by traditional gender roles at the time this trope came to be canon in slasher films. The patriarchal norm for women remaining virgins until marriage mirrors them as pure and also desirable, while the opposing promiscuous females are punished for their impurity, thus conditioning the women who view slasher films to want to avoid sex, as it could lead them to a fatal end metaphorically, undesirable in reality, while celibacy would earn them a, quote, life. This ideology was put into place within the frameworks of modern cinema, as the messages within a film are by far the most influential of any other medium. The following research will uncover how films are able to coerce the viewers to prefer virginity to sexual activity, where the idea behind making the final girl a virgin came about, and of course, in regards to slasher films, discover what's so wrong with having sex. Before examining these questions, we must first understand the trope of the final girl and how the virgin compares to the other female characters in popular slasher films. John Carpenter's Halloween, released in 1978, introduces the viewer to an iconic Laurie Strode, played by Jamie Lee Curtis, an immaculate example of a final girl who fits the bill to successfully survive a slasher movie. She is intelligent, modest, and virginal. Laurie upholds these gender roles with flying colors and goes even further by jumping ahead to virgin mother status, proving herself as a capable, perfect wife with mothering instincts, according to Morgan Pedraza. Our heroine thus plays mother to both children, while Annie leaves to have sex with her boyfriend. Laurie proves herself capable of the duties that will be required of her as a mother, from acting as a protector to cooking and entertaining. Alternatively, her friends are boy crazy and have sex with their partners while brushing off their responsibilities for Laurie to take care of. Her friends die one by one post-intercourse, leaving Laurie by herself to fight the killer off and escape, using nothing but her wits and her virginal purity as defense, along with a butcher knife and a wire hanger. Behind the curtain, we see the reinforcement of the traditional gender roles, still tricking the viewer into believing there is a right and a wrong way to express your sexuality as a woman. Almost a decade later, Wes Craven introduced A Nightmare on Elm Street in 1984. Although Halloween's Laurie Strode is perhaps the most well-known final girl, Nightmare's Nancy Thompson, played by Heather Langenkamp, is perhaps one of the most resilient and clever, as she actually prepares and executes her own survivalist research in order to set traps to draw Freddy Krueger from the dream world into her world and expose him. She may be looked up to as a final girl badass. However, she does have another trick up her sleeve that is unspoken yet assumed throughout the movie, keeping her alive: her virginity. What's different about Nancy is that she has a boyfriend, but does not have sex with him on screen. It is assumed that Nancy is a virgin throughout the film, and this is key. Final girls have their virginity, and experienced girls have one thing in common too. According to Jody Keisner, women are repeatedly killed, apparently in conformance to the monster's attempt at repressing the dangerous sexuality they exhibit during an obligatory nude scene or seek out during the course of the film. Annie, played by Nancy Keys, a high school girl and one of Laurie Strode's friends in the movie Halloween, is a unique example of a slasher victim. She does not have intercourse in the film. However, she makes it known that she is not a virgin. There is even a scene where she is naked apart from her underwear, being watched unknowingly by the killer Michael Myers. A few scenes later, she is strangled to death in a car in her garage. Linda, played by PJ Souls, another friend of Laurie's in the film, has a sex scene with her boyfriend and after is killed by Michael Myers. To summarize how these teenage characters are presented in slasher films, J.B. Weaver states, "Boys and girls who play around get murdered by the maniac while the virginal heroine survives, evidently because she refuses what the films picture as a kind of moral decadence. The slasher film does well by embedding certain moral codes within it and disguising it as purely fictional entertainment." Furthermore, slasher films coerced viewers into agreeing that sex before marriage was bad and virginity was something to be sought after by all women who wanted to be desirable by the men who laid down this very framework. In order to understand the pattern of virginity being valued as, quote, good and sexual promiscuity seen as, quote, wrong within the slasher film, the traditional gender roles in place during the high point of the slasher film, the 1970s and 80s, must be unveiled. Virginity was held in high value as stated by Laura Carpenter, by young women surveyed in the late 1970s and 1980s. Furthermore, according to a study by David Harding and Christopher Jenks, in 1968, more than 75% of American adults with an opinion on premarital sex said that it was wrong. By the 1980s, only 33 to 37% of American adults said that premarital sex was either always or almost always wrong. This allows the concluding reasoning of why the final girl was written as a chaste young woman, juxtaposed with her peers who have sex, are unmarried, and pay with their lives. The aforementioned on-screen deaths of the girls who are sexually active are the main point of focus for the audience. Not only do sexually active women die on the screen, their death scenes are long and brutal compared to other characters. According to Andrew Welsh, the death scenes for female characters who engage in sexual activity were significantly longer than the average length of death scenes for female characters who did not engage in sexual activity. The women alongside the final girl protagonist are not only killed for having sex, they are tortured as well, sometimes partially nude when it happens. Quoted further by Andrew Welsh, attractive female characters, or quote, bad girls, are promiscuous, undress, and flaunt their bodies, but are simultaneously punished for their sexuality with lethal violence. This message is sent directly to every, quote, bad girl viewing a horror movie and discovering where they fit into the slasher equation. Juxtapose this message with the heroic acts of the, quote, good girl, and any virgin in the audience will gain something they can connect with. Virginity, not as a burden, but as a life-saving gift, addressed by Laura Carpenter. Adherents viewed virginity as a worthy personal and social identity, which they were proud to claim. Viewers are forced to come to terms with aligning their values to traditional gender roles upheld for decades. Sex before marriage is, quote, bad, while a, quote, good virginal bride is sought after as the ideal partner. A virgin, in the case of men looking for spouses, is superior to the sexually active victims. And what better way to amplify this message to the masses than through film? Film is one of the biggest influencers of people. Films portraying young women as abstaining from sex were motivators to shape the thoughts of viewers, especially teenage girls. Having a virginal bride will lead to a happy life, and a woman will be the primary caregiver of children and husband, while the man will be the breadwinner. In contrast, sexually active girls are seen as ruined and furthermore unwanted. As summarized by Laura Carpenter, virginity loss was framed as an irrevocable loss of innocence and, if it took place outside of marriage, as the onset of moral corruption, madness, and even death. This belief in regards to sex before marriage was amplified for the big screen, with the slasher film as a catalyst to disperse the message. The value of a virgin is equivalent to living a long and full life within the walls of a horror movie, and can easily be transferred to a man's choice of a female companion, as quoted by Shelley Cobb. Virginity, then, as a commodity of patriarchy, which was the value of a prospective wife to a husband, had to be verifiable by men. The virginity of the final girl is verifiable by the killer, by her very survival. Man's dominance over woman can be seen illustrated within the very premise of patriarchal ideology. A virgin bride is sought after because she is smart, capable, pure, and a mother figure. That innocence and lack of experience is paramount to a man's choice of partner, summarized by research surveys conducted by L.A. Mundy. Whether first sex occurred within or outside of a committed relationship, younger men tended to stress concern over their sexual performance. Thus, instead of pregnancy and commitment issues, men's sexual anxiety manifested in whether or not they had enough sexual expertise to provide women with sexual pleasure. Simply put, men prefer virgins because they fear they will be compared with other men sexually and therefore can be emasculated due to inadequate performance or lack of experience, or both. In the same breath, these men must also have sex with as many women as possible in order to gain experience so they are not judged by their partner. The anticipation of sleeping with an experienced woman can make men, as quoted by Mundy, literally feel scared. The antagonist in the slasher film has a similar agenda when killing off sexually active women, as stated by Carol Clover. The reason she must be killed rather than fucked is that slasher killers are, by generic definition, sexually inadequate. Men who kill precisely because they cannot fuck. The killer is the equivalent of a sexually inexperienced man against sexually experienced young women. The best plan is to get rid of the woman who can compare him to other men and deal solely with the virgin. The slasher film is the perfect package to deliver this masculine propaganda. Viewers are watching the final girl escape unscathed, without the distraction of sex and lust, but the viewers are also seeing a brand of the stigma placed on females engaging in premarital sex. Only a film can showcase these two opposing viewpoints and persuade the viewer who is, quote, good and who is, quote, bad, based on the murder victim. The film showcases that the female victims who die after sex somehow deserved it, as stated by Andrew Welsh. When the female complainant has a prior history of sexual conduct and, as such, does not conform to normative sexual standards expected of women, she is perceived as having instigated the assault. The virginal girl is celebrated for staying safe, while we berate the girls who had sex. It is much more effective to persuade a viewer to agree with something by allowing them to experience a strong emotional reaction to events unfolding in the film, as stated by Jody Keisner. Viewers become emotionally involved in the horror movie experience, not logically involved. During this emotional involvement with the final girl or anyone else in the film, the viewer can easily latch onto what that film is trying to convey, the proper role of a woman. The purpose of this ideology is to gain the upper hand in a relationship, seek out a virgin spouse with no fear of comparison to other men, and maintain power, then what better way to show what will happen to a virgin compared to promiscuous women than killing them and allowing the other to survive? The virgins in the audience will silently thank themselves as heroes, while the women who have had intercourse see their metaphorical fate splattered across the screen. In conclusion, horror films come in many shapes and sizes, but the slasher film has a single constant, the trope of the final girl, a permanent fixture in the canonical slasher film. This virginal protagonist is set apart and delivers a specific message regarding sex before marriage. It leads to death in the film. This sends a message to any female viewers reinforcing patriarchal ideology laced within the scenes of the slasher film. Virgins are the ideal partners because they uphold traditional gender roles, how women should be. Films are the one method of communication that can take different ideas and disperse them to massive audiences worldwide. Furthermore, films have their own methods of persuasion, and it is easy to amplify a message directly to an audience by tugging at the heartstrings and tampering with emotions, making virgins feel empowered and making sexually active teenagers feel bad about themselves. The final girl is a virgin, as well as a mother figure, and this is what is desired by men laying out this ideology within the slasher film. Men prefer a virgin partner and avoid women who have had sex, because if she has experience with other men, then she holds the power to compare him to other men. This leads to fear, anxiety, and a loss of power dynamics. Because of this, the final girl was created, a virgin all women can aspire to become, while her friends fall around her because, quote, sex equals death. Some references from my full-length paper, and thank everybody and have a good morning. I appreciate your time and attention.
Okay, thank you, Professor Kunkel. The next paper is by Professor Kevin McGuiness, who is an art history professor at Niagara College in Southern Ontario. He recently completed his PhD in interdisciplinary humanities at Brock University, and his previous education included a master's degree in comparative literature and arts and an honors BA in visual arts. His research topics include folklore, film studies, and psychoanalysis, and his dissertation examined the presence of archetypes in the American slasher film. He's an accomplished writer and recently completed a critical essay focusing on Derek Jarman's 1976 film Sebastian, which included an anthology entitled Virgin Envy, published by the University of Virginia Press. His scholarly writings have also been published by Oxford journal Monsters and the Monstrous, and his research has been presented at the prestigious Current Research in Egyptology conference held in Europe. Finally, his academic work has led to the creation of various short films, which have garnered numerous international awards. And he's presenting a paper today called Death in the Maiden, the Development of the Feminine Psyche in the Slasher Film.
Hi, thank you very much, Dr. Brinkman. I really appreciate that. I've actually pre-recorded my presentation out of fear that I might go over time or screw up at some point. So I'm just going to share the link to it, and hopefully you enjoy it. A young virginal heroine is stalked and eventually attacked by a psychopathic killer in a moment of destructive eroticism. This is the disturbing scene depicted at the climax of almost every slasher film. In this presentation, I will examine two of the most widely recognized films in this subgenre, Halloween and A Nightmare on Elm Street, through a psychoanalytic lens in order to better understand the emotional and symbolic significance of this violent exchange between the protagonist and villain. Specifically, I will analyze these films in the light of Jungian scholar Erich Neumann's text, Amour and Psyche, in which he proposed that during the development of the feminine psyche, the subject must undergo a rite of passage called the marriage to death. During this stage of development, the individual is either literally or symbolically wed to death, embodied by a monstrous villain, and must confront this figure in order to attain psychological maturity. This encounter with death symbolically expresses the act of sexual intercourse and is necessary for the subject to cross the threshold into adulthood. Neumann goes on to state that the marriage to death theme is a common narrative trope that is featured in myths, tales, and other cultural texts. In my research, I propose that this theme is dramatized in the slasher film through the violent confrontation between the final girl and the killer. Though the heroines in these films are not literally married to their villainous counterparts, they share a sexually charged relationship rooted in repression and express their libidinal impulses through the violence they perpetrate against one another. It is through her intelligence and wit that the slasher heroine is able to confront and overcome death to successfully reach the state of individuation and become a fully realized adult. Neumann was a German-born Israeli philosopher and psychologist who wrote extensively on the role of archetypes in art, religion, and myth. His most notable works include The Origins and History of Consciousness, The Great Mother, and Amour and Psyche, all of which address the arduous process that the human psyche undergoes during maturation. He was one of Jung's closest intellectual allies and essentially functioned as his protege, carrying on his work concerning parental archetypes in psychological development. In Amour and Psyche, he uses Greco-Roman mythology to outline the 5 stages involved in the development of the feminine psyche, which includes the introduction, the marriage to death, the act, the 4 tasks, and the happy ending. In his analysis of the marriage to death, Neumann characterizes this phase as a symbolic articulation of the physical act of intercourse, as experienced by the subject. He describes this event as a rite of passage that marks the individual's transition into adulthood, and is often experienced metaphorically as a terrifying act of sacrifice, in which the subject is offered up to a monster, dragon, wizard, or evil spirit. In such narratives, the villain threatens to arrest the psychological development of the female protagonist, and consequently she must confront and overcome him in order to reach maturity. Such stories feature a female protagonist who is either literally or metaphorically wed to a death-like male figure, and must uncover the truth about her adversary in order to escape his fatal grip. By surviving her encounter with this monster, the heroine reaches a new level of consciousness and fulfills her psychological potential. Within the framework of the slasher film, we see this dynamic occur between the heroine and the villain. The female protagonist is faced with the responsibility of subduing or conquering the figure of death that is manifested in the form of a masked or disfigured villain. In these narratives, sexual impulses are sublimated into violence, and the act of killing is transformed into the perverted expression of the villain's masculine sexual energy. At the climax of the slasher film, the heroine encounters the personification of death and must overcome her shock and fear in order to end his destructive reign. As Carol Clover points out, it is the final girl who looks death in the face and possesses the integrity and courage to overcome him in the final act of the film. Through the process of waging battle with the villain, the female protagonist undergoes a process of maturation that marks her transformation into adulthood. Developing the rational facets of her psyche, she must master the art of logos in order to develop a strategy to surmount her adversary's attacks and conquer him. This rite of passage is accompanied by the revelation of a strange kinship that she shares with the villain and binds the two of them together on a psychological level. This relationship is either explicitly acknowledged within the narrative or revealed symbolically through the aesthetic structure of the film. This motif is most readily observed in Halloween, as an intense psychological bond between Laurie Strode and Michael Myers is established through the use of subjective camera work. Similarly, Nancy Thompson of A Nightmare on Elm Street shares a disturbing connection with Freddy Krueger due to the fact that her parents took an active role in his death by immolation. These explicit links between heroine and villain serve to symbolically highlight their archetypal compatibility in the film's narrative. The final girl and the killer embody opposing psychological principles and are therefore ideal adversaries, as their encounter at the conclusion of the film resolves the tension that is built throughout the narrative. Despite their differences, both the heroine and villain in the slasher film frequently exhibit the quality of sexual frustration that is expressed through the violence that they perpetrate against one another. The sublimation of the heroine's sexuality into acts of aggression allows her to appropriate and manipulate the killer's weapons. This quality of the final girl also results in a bizarre kinship with the villain, as he similarly exhibits a repressed and/or sublimated sexual drive. Their savage interactions are consequently transformed into expressions of libidinal energy, and the prospect of death becomes a metaphor for the consummation of the sexual facets of their relationship. Perhaps the clearest illustration of this notion is presented through the violent clashes between the characters of Michael Myers and Laurie Strode in John Carpenter's Halloween. Throughout the course of the film, it is insinuated that Laurie and Michael share a unique relationship rooted in sexual repression. Both heroine and villain have sublimated their energies into alternate activities, resulting in Michael's preoccupation with violent acts of destruction and Laurie's fixation on her schoolwork and other responsibilities. This quality is noted in both characters by John Carpenter, who described the film as the revenge of the repressed. Similarly, Kendall Phillips points out that both Michael and Laurie are sexual misfits with stunted and immature libidinal drives, a fact which explains why they are presented as mirror opposites in the film. However, their contradictory natures are what paradoxically bind Laurie and Michael together, as they are united through their symbolic opposition to one another, representing the conflicting forces of life and death. Within the microcosm of the film, it is repeatedly suggested that these two antithetical characters are fated to meet and are perfectly matched to wage battle, permitting them an opportunity to externalize their sexual energy through a series of violent confrontations. In a perverse twist, Laurie and Michael are posited as bizarre lovers in the narrative structure of Halloween, bound together by their mutual plight of sexual frustration. This notion is established early in the film, when Laurie is asked by her father, a real estate agent, to leave a key under the mat of the Myers house so he can show it to prospective buyers. Unbeknownst to Laurie, as she walks onto the Myers property, she is being watched by Michael from inside the house, and upon catching sight of this young woman trespassing on his property, he becomes instantly fixated on her. Through the screen door of the Myers house, the camera captures Michael's silhouette rising from the shadows as Laurie walks up the front steps of the porch to drop off the key. The over-the-shoulder camera shot of Myers places Laurie and him in the same visual space and forces the viewer to witness the heroine through his desirous eyes. As the scene continues, Laurie begins her journey to school, humming a lullaby to herself that features the lyrics, "I wish I had you all alone, just the two of us," all the while oblivious to the fact that Michael continues to watch her. Again, Carpenter utilizes an over-the-shoulder shot of Michael on the sidewalk outside the Myers home as Laurie walks away, thereby hinting at a sexual connection between these two characters. This reading of Carpenter's direction is supported by the fact that in the soundtrack to the scene, the audience can hear Laurie's singing, overlaid with the unsettling and almost sensuous sound of Michael's heavy breathing. This sequence insinuates that Myers is the fulfillment of Laurie's repressed desire to have a boyfriend, and establishes a disturbing link between the two characters. In a later scene, it is further suggested that Laurie and Michael not only share a psychosexual connection, but their eventual encounter at the conclusion of the film has been preordained. As Laurie sits in class, listening to her teacher discuss the concept of fate in relation to the text The Life of Collins by moralist Samuel Johnson, she glances out the window and catches sight of Myers on the street returning her stare. Carpenter's choice of a wide shot to capture the image of Myers on the roadway is intended to convey Laurie's point of view, and thus the audience sees him through her eyes. The teacher's monologue that can be heard in the soundtrack alludes to the fact that, much like Collins, Laurie is on a predetermined path that will culminate in her encounter with Myers. Fate caught up with several lives here. No matter what course of action William Collins took, he was destined to his own fate, his own day of reckoning. As the teacher concludes her lesson, Laurie once again glances out the classroom window to discover that Myers has vanished, insinuating that he is a manifestation of Laurie's imagination and sexual frustration. This scene lays the groundwork for the peculiar sexual bond between heroine and villain that will later be fulfilled through their violent interactions. Sexual repression is a pervasive theme in the slasher subgenre and functions as a consolidating force that connects the final girl and the killer. In these films, the villain is able to release his libidinal impulses through the ruthless act of unjustified murder. This savage behavior serves as a symbolic substitute for sexual intercourse, and thus the relationship between victim and killer is metaphorically consummated. This disturbing correlation between sex and death in the slasher film was noted by Robin Wood, who argued that the release of sexuality in the horror film is always presented as perverted, monstrous, and excessive. This accounts for the fact that the deaths of female victims in the slasher film tend to be particularly prominent and graphic in nature. Through their demise, the villain's female victims are quite literally transformed into the brides of death, who often keeps their mortal remains in his lair as trophies. These secondary characters are therefore of key importance in the narrative structure of the film, as they anticipate the villain's meeting with his final bride, the heroine, who is frequently a chaste female. This narrative structure is presented in A Nightmare on Elm Street, whereupon Freddy is posited as Nancy's perverted love interest, and their violent exchanges function as manifestations of their libidinal energy. Freddy is more overtly sexualized than Myers, and possesses a carnal appetite that is both insatiable and depraved, expressing his libido through sadistic acts of cruelty that often result in the death of his victims. In fulfilling this task, Freddy will posit his victim as a sexual object for his personal enjoyment, a dynamic that is particularly prevalent in relation to Nancy, since she is the central target. In an interview, the actor Robert Englund commented on this practice when he pointed out that by entering Nancy's dreams, as well as those of her peers, Krueger is able to violate his victim in an unprecedented fashion. Freddy's in those teenage girls' bedrooms. He's in their bed with them. That's more of a violation than rape. Freddy's preoccupation with Nancy is motivated by the fact that she possesses opposing psychological qualities, and therefore represents his ideal adversary. The sexual battle in which they are engaged is therefore rooted in their archetypal properties, and Freddy's desire to murder Nancy is a manifestation of his longing to destroy her narratological role as a force of goodness within the community. In response, she struggles to protect herself and her peers from the destructive force of the villain and ensure a future for the citizens of Springwood. The strange sexual tension between Nancy and Krueger is one of the central driving forces behind A Nightmare on Elm Street, and becomes an increasingly conspicuous element as the film progresses. This theme is clearly implied during Nancy's fourth dream sequence when she is attacked by Freddy while lying in a bathtub. As Nancy soaks in the warm water, Kruger's glove emerges from between her legs, directly juxtaposing the soft flesh of her thighs with the tarnished steel of Freddy's claws. Transforming the tub into a pit, Freddy grabs at her naked body and attempts to drag Nancy down to a watery grave. Douglas Rathgeb states that this scene is intended to imply that Nancy and Kruger are potential sex partners, and that they have somehow become compatible within the film's moral scheme. Indeed, as the film progresses, Freddy increasingly becomes the physical embodiment of Nancy's sexual frustrations and the nightmarish manifestation of her dream lover. This notion is revisited in a later scene, when Nancy tries to desperately contact Glenn via the telephone in order to save him from falling asleep and becoming another one of Freddy's victims. However, instead of reaching Glenn, Nancy hears Freddy's chilling voice on the other end of the line, telling her, "I'm your boyfriend now." The phone then partially morphs into a tongue, a manifestation of Freddy's dream power, and begins violently licking Nancy's lips. Commenting on this scene, Rathgeb argues that Kruger's objective is to become Nancy's dream lover, to legitimize sexually the union of their two rapidly converging worlds. Actress Heather Langenkamp, who played the role of Nancy, echoes these sentiments in an interview, stating that Nancy and Freddy's relationship has always had a sexual component. These strange and unsettling vignettes between Nancy and Freddy clearly illustrate the convergence of sex and violence in their relationship, which functions as the centerpiece of the film. Kruger's continued use of perverted sexual innuendo in his interactions with Nancy is rooted in the fact that she is his ideal foil and represents his ultimate challenge, both romantically and psychologically. The sexual link between the final girl and the villain reaches its culmination in the dramatic confrontation that generally occurs at the conclusion of the slasher film. The act of facing the killer marks a moment of transformation in the life of the female protagonist and symbolizes her graduation into adulthood. By confronting death, personified in the form of the villain, the heroine transitions into a state of consciousness, whereby she is aware of morbidity in the world. Much like the act of heterosexual intercourse and its potentially harrowing consequences, which includes the breaking of the hymen and the possibility of pregnancy, disease, and death, surviving her encounter with the villain signifies that she is no longer a child, but has become a woman. As Molly Haskell indicates, for heterosexual women, crossing the threshold into adulthood is a treacherous moment, as sexual penetration is more a terror than an opportunity. For the final girl, this rite of passage is experienced purely on the symbolic level, as the heroine and villain never consciously acknowledge the sexual implications of their actions, nor do they physically consummate their relationship. Instead, the violent interactions that they share function euphemistically to express their libidinal energy and externalize their sexual drives. According to Sue Short, by confronting the villain, the final girl embarks on a journey to acquire truth and identity, and along the way showcases her strength, ingenuity, and elevated sense of awareness. Clover supports Short's reading of the heroine's experience in the slasher film, explaining that when the final girl stands at last in the light of day with the knife in her hand, she has delivered herself into the adult world. As Short and Clover demonstrate, the curious and compassionate nature of these women may place them in peril, but it is also what leads them out of danger and transforms them into heroines. I agree with the observations of these scholars and argue that Newman's writings provide a psychological grounding for their insights. This encounter with death manifests in the form of a transgression. The slasher villain will either violate the heroine physically, as seen in Halloween, or on a psychological level, as displayed in A Nightmare on Elm Street. In the slasher film, the female protagonist is victimized by the villain, who attempts to sabotage her sense of selfhood and thereby annihilate her. The act of facing the killer symbolizes an encounter with death, and the final girl's ability to survive this experience is predicated on both her intellectual acumen as well as her physical agility. Through the appropriation and manipulation of the villain's weapon, she is able to externalize her sexual energy through acts of aggression and self-assertion. By defending herself and thwarting the killer's attacks, the final girl is able to reach psychological maturity and fulfill her potential. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor McGuiness, for that awesome paper. Our next paper will be by Professor Charlotte Baker, who is an author, associate lecturer, and PhD student at the University of Derby. She's going to be presenting her paper, The Evolved Final Girl, Reconfiguring Identification and Space for Women's Narratives.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm just going to try and share my screen. Hopefully you can see this. Hopefully it's working. Firstly, thank you to Daniel and Wickham for putting this camp together. It's been amazing. To spend time with people and hear all these interesting ideas has been great, particularly through the last year where it's not been possible. So thank you so much. I am here today to talk about the Evolved Final Girl, Reconfiguring Identification and Space for Women's Narratives. So this paper is a condensed part of a section of a chapter in my PhD in which I'm looking at how spaces are created for women on screen in horror television and how identificatory processes are created. So what I'm doing is I'm managing the dynamics between on-screen characters creation, representations of women and audiences identification to see how TV is sort of playing about and reconstructing this space for women and in particular women horror fans. There we go. Okay, so Slasher. So Slasher is a TV anthology horror series. It's Canadian American and created by Aaron Martin. The fourth one, I didn't actually know when it was out, but Wickham said I think it was on Friday that it was out. So that's what I'm going to be doing tomorrow, is watching that. So the first, there's 3 seasons that are out at the moment, and this presentation is primarily focused on the third one, on Solstice. However, there's an element that I wanted to talk about. The reason that all 3 are up is because of the component of intertextuality. Intertextuality is going to be a key thread which will enable me to tie a lot of what I'm going to be talking about together. In terms of women's experiences, intertextuality is often used to be reconfigured by creators to play with or subvert audiences' expectations of the text. So you can see how intertextuality is used there. Each season engages in particular kind of sets of slasher narrative and history. So the first season, which is the first one you can see, is very much within the domestic setting. It's, echoing Halloween, stuff like that. The second season, The Guilty Party, is very much that camp counselor kind of vibe, Friday the 13th, stuff like that. And the third one is Solstice, is very much within this urban setting. So you can see how already there's these elements of intertextuality that are being kind of, pulled on, if you like, as well as the name itself. Essentially, there are 3 important aspects that I'm going to be mapping. I'm going to be looking at the effects, the pressures and choices made by women creators in horror. I'm also going to be looking at the representation of women, the varied and inclusive sort of presentation on screen, and also how this representation is then transferred to real life discourses of women. Okay, so I was lucky enough to be able to interview Lucy Page, who is a co-writer of Slasher, who also asked Ian Carpenter and Aaron Martin to answer a few of my questions as well. And the whole point of not just this presentation, but my PhD as well, was sort of inspired by my own experiences as a woman in horror, writing this sort of violent stuff. Really, I was asked when I had my first book published to remove my name and use my initials, because if it was written by a woman, then it would likely sell less. If it was written by a man, it was most likely to sell more. And being young, and it being 8 years ago, I thought, okay, I was annoyed, but you've got to do what you've got to do. And I assumed and hoped that things were more progressive, that things were moving forward and everything like that. And then I interviewed Lucy Page not so long ago, March this year, I think. And I just wanted this really struck a chord with me. And when I got this, and I've been doing the PhD obviously for a few years now, when I got this, I thought it gave me real inspiration to keep wanting to research these kind of areas. So over the course of my writing career, I've lost track of how many times either I or colleagues have been asked to make female characters likable, or to show them ranking motherhood higher in their lives, I have never once received the same note on a male character. It infuriates me when women are held to a different standard of behaviour. Women are human, they have flaws. They can be terrible caregivers. They may have nothing more than a passing interest in their children. Women don't have to be likeable. Audiences can love them for their flaws, like we love bad men in so many television series and films, which is why I've loved the freedom and opportunity to portray the women of Slasher differently, as real people. So these ideas essentially enable me to kind of look at concepts of women, representation, processes of identification, and television as well. And obviously there is, you know, a lot of the presentations have been based, you know, on films. This one is based obviously on television series. And the concept of Clover's final girl again is cinematic. So I've had a job, if you like, to try and move that through in terms of, you know, making it work for television. So I'm just going to try and piece that together for you a little bit. So obviously we're aware of Clover's final girl, but I'd just like you to think about the approach she uses to identification, which is heavily influenced by psychoanalysis. And while she views gender as a social construction, a particular point of interest is this mode and model of identification. To summarise it quite simplistically for time reasons, she aligns women's identification with the final girl as through emotionality, and men's identification with the final girl through the aggression. Obviously, women's identification there is quite passive, whereas men's is quite active. It seems to create a very clear-cut binary about how these ideas work, and this led me to a couple of questions that I wanted to explore. So what happens when we look at emotionality in the processes of identification from an active stance, from an empowering position? And again, these ideas, as Wickham acknowledged in the introduction to this conference, about these being founding theories, but the times and texts have changed. How do we explore these ideas in terms of contemporary television and horror and the final girl? So Cohen's works was really interesting because he really examined identification and the ways in which it was being examined and being used in all kinds of disciplines, in all kinds of different ways, through psychoanalysis, through to media studies. And he found this, he came up with this very broad understanding of identification and its increased loss of self-awareness and your alignment with a character. He also acknowledged the role of, the social groups and the leaders and the fans and that kind of communal aspect of enjoying these things. However, Cohen doesn't acknowledge gender as being an important role within this. So Cohen sees identification as removing oneself. The varying intensity of identification reflects the extent to which one exchanges his or own perspective for that of another and is able to forget him or herself. I argue that actually it's not about forgetting. Identification isn't about forgetting. It's almost the opposite. It's about aligning. It's about a textual closeness between what you experience and the character. It can be empathy or mirroring or reflection or something within that character that you see in yourself. That's how I believe identification is created. However, Cohen was really interested in terms of that varying intensity. He doesn't really expand on what that means. But for me, that was a bridge for me to kind of use the stuff or to bridge the stuff from cinematic understanding of identification and pull it through to televisual, because it is a varying intensity. While you can examine the cinematic experience of watching a film in a cinema as intense, you ultimately know that within an hour and a half or 2.5 hours, if it's midsummer, that period of time is over. That intensity will stop at that moment of time. Whereas with television, it's a completely different experience. It's that varying intensity is entirely in your control. You can binge watch 12 episodes a day if you want, back to back to back to back. You can go once a week if you want. It's all kind of, Sharma explained it as this courtship period, particularly with streaming services like Slasher. So how does this varying intensity, how does that experience of watching, of viewing, and of absorbing these kind of things, along with that alignment, empathy, mirroring, reflection, work in terms of identification and watching it? So Gorton kind of acknowledged that there was this emotional attachment, which perhaps aligns slightly closer to my understanding of identification. And she acknowledges that there are technical processes in which evokes identification. So creators can basically elicit these kind of responses in viewers, which is, again, an important way in which we view our characters. Obviously, they're the way that they're framed and the way that they're put together, which is why Lucy Page and other creators, the way in which they're beginning to, their writing influences the actual framing and shots of these characters, therefore influences our process of identification. And again, to go back to intertextuality, our intertextual knowledge is used by creators to inform our identification through the way that it's framed, etc., and align our emotions. Randy from Scream and Noah from Scream the TV series was also a good kind of point for me to use there, because again, you can tell through intertextuality and how our identification is going to be formed. And again, in Slasher, in the second season, it does it really well, because it is framed as the first episode with Andy, who is, again, that kind of unisex name, and she is the first character's narrative we're exposed to. She is the lead. She leads that episode really, really well, and therefore we assume via our intertextual knowledge that she is our final girl, and therefore we begin to, formulate our understanding of identification with her. Spoiler, sorry. At the end of that episode, she's killed. So again, you can see how creators are really playing about with how these processes of intertextuality and identification work, and how it can kind of begin to move the meaning. Another thing is, because it's a sort of anthology series like American Horror Story, the context, the meaning, and the character all changes via this element of casting intertextuality, where the same cast is used but with different characters. And within the microcosm of the series, it's recognised that in every season, each character is being pushed, and our understanding and meanings are questioned and kind of really challenged in terms of what they are meant to represent. Okay, so audience's intertextual knowledge of horror and the final girl is played into by creators to build identification, like I said with Andy, only for them to be manipulated, broken, expanded, subverted, so that representation is renegotiated in order to provide space for more diverse women's narratives in the slasher text. And actually, these few characters, who are all kind of taken from different seasons, give us quite a good understanding of that. Sarah who is the top left. She is the first protagonist in First Final Girl in the first season of Slasher. And she gives us, again, she already, seeing her story helps us kind of build an understanding of how this isn't what we're used to. She isn't a teenager. This isn't in school. This isn't necessarily to do with, boyfriends and things like that. Everything that we think we know about a slasher is kind of, has to be reconfigured pretty quickly. But what she does experience are real adulthood issues, housing issues, and all these other things that we can begin to kind of pinpoint on. Cassidy, who's the one with pink hair, again, she is in the third season, and she occupies a really interesting space, because we go back in the third season to more of a traditional understanding of a slasher in terms of teenagers and stuff. But actually, she is the first, or one of the first, to be killed. But she is very much the bully. She abuses our protagonist, our real final girl, and is really quite aggressive. But she also has, throughout the season, we have various flashbacks to her home life, and we see that she's very much kind of an abused person herself. She hasn't got a particularly pleasant life, and has to kind of manage and cope with her alcoholic and racist father. So there are various things as well that begin to break down the stereotype of her as being this abusive bully. That gives us another element to think about and consider. There's also Violet, who's at the top. And she's also in the same season. And again, she's sort of in her mid-20s. She's a social media addict. She's trying to be a blogger, all those other kind of things that, again, are identifiable with that teen slasher in some ways. But also, she has marital issues. She has to deal with revenge porn, and then also has to engage in revenge porn. So there's all these different things as well that are kind of examining women's experiences in the real world, both, teenage and adult. That is, looking at it in a different way. And then there's Jen. Jen is the, according to Ian Carpenter, who was co-writer for the 3rd season, Jen is the fan favourite of the season. She is currently in this season, she's suffering family bereavement, she's struggling with her own mental health, and she's also her mother's girlfriend's caregiver. So she has a lot to manage and a lot to balance, which essentially influences a lot of her behaviour, which is, you know, quite challenging to watch at times. Okay, so moving on to Sadia. Sadia is a really interesting character, and for me, it was the moment in which I started to really kind of know that Slasher. I had to study Slasher. It had to go in this chapter, because for me, she broke so many kind of molds of what the final girl should be. She's very, very independent. Her agency is what is inspiring. And she very much has this approach to life in general of being a good person. Every act she does is you know, perfect, is great, is good. And you're almost waiting for her to do something, or something to be revealed and that she's done something wrong. But the more hours, you know, the 12 hours that you spend with her, you get to realise she is good through and through. There's nothing that you can say is going against her. She's lovely. She's a genuinely nice character. Her history is horrendous. You can tell that she's made the decisions she makes based on her own experiences, to be kind, to be good. She lost all her family in a war. She's had to rebuild her life and move, and the place that they've moved to. Cassidy's dad, from the last slide, set up a petition to have them removed. Genuinely really, really quite awful experiences. And you can see why that builds this kind of kindness in her. And lovability, and she's lovely. She really is genuinely so nice. I had to put her in. And then in those last few moments of the final episode, hashtag you reap what you sow, she tweeted something months prior to the season. It was a flashback, months prior to what we experienced, that starts everything, that starts a string of murders, that influences her own best friends' lives, everything. So all this kind of the tweet, there's a misjudged act, which most of us will have probably done at some point, then becomes this moment of great trauma, of violence, and of death. And it really strikes you that while she is this seemingly perfect person, she has a flaw. She's human. And actually our identification or identificatory processes don't work against her in that sense. They work for her, because we like her even more, because she's human. She's not something to be held on a pedestal, who is doing, who is making all these really correct decisions. She's human. She makes mistakes, and that's why we really engage with her. So rather than it, having a negative impact on our identification, it has a positive. And one of the final points I wanted to kind of raise was this element of fan communities. I said to you a little while ago about fan communities being this, Jen being a fan favourite, as Ian Carpenter told me. Number 2 was Sadia. So the fans loved her and everything else. And that's partly what I'm looking at. I'm looking at how all these things are complicated and complex. And Cohen, in his piece on identification, examines how these individual processes are so different per person. And I think because I'm doing ethnographic work as well, I suppose I wanted to take a moment to look at what identification is and how we examine it, which is through people's response. And we look at it with scholarly interest and with this kind of very much, academic view of things. And it's worthwhile just being reminded that, we've talked about it through what Gordon said and what Cohen said about this emotional engagement and this investment that they have and this varied intensity. It's a very emotional experience that is kind of really entangled, in terms of ethics, in their own exploration of identity and things. And I just wanted to kind of take a moment to acknowledge that it's important to recognize how identification is different for every single person. And it's a very, private and personal experience, which quite often we speak to quite broadly and quite, in kind of very broad, wide terms. And these representations are enabling smaller groups of women to be able to find, people on screen to identify with and engage with and consequently explore their own identity. So yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing if I can. Hope that's worked.
Well, thank you for those really wonderful papers. We had a few questions in the comment section, so I'll try to get to as many of those as we can, or get as wide a dispersal of the questions as we can. I saw one that I thought might apply to a couple different people, so maybe I'll start there. Sort of jumping off of what Charlotte just talked about sort of like individual responses to films, or the sort of multiplicity of responses that we can have to films. So Mark Adams asked, I wonder how you feel about films that try and subvert how the final girl should be read. Scream, for example, I'm riffing a little bit here now, but Scream, for example, explicitly states, allows its final girl to have sex and not be killed. So Scream is overt, but there are also films with males, and we also had a question about the male final girl. Is it Nightmare on Elm Street 2 or 3? I can't remember. But anyway, so how do we feel about male survivors and non-virgin heroes? Do we have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of there's Scream, I think it's Scream the TV series, season 3 does it as well. And I think it engages in these kind of, again, our expectations and our understandings of it. And particularly in Scream the TV series, that 3rd season, you get a real detailed emotional landscape of the character, that the depth that television allows, that sometimes cinema doesn't because of the time, issues. So for me, in terms of process of identification, I think television allows us to understand emotionally the landscape of the characters far more, and to see that in terms of the male final girl in Scream TV series was really effective for me. I think it was really well done, engaged in really interesting, concepts and approaches to manipulate and move about what we expect with the final girl.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interject. It's a really fascinating question because what we find is that in many of the franchises where there is a male hero, such as A Nightmare on Elm Street 2 and in Friday the 13th, I think part 4 and 5, where there is a male hero, there seems to be the whole narrative structure seems to shift when it's a male protagonist versus a female protagonist, where in those series, instead of the heroine and villain being in opposition to one another, the hero, in trying to conquer the villain, actually becomes the villain. So in the case of A Nightmare on Elm Street, the character of Jesse actually transforms into the physical equivalent of Freddy Krueger, and in Friday the 13th, the character of, I think his name is Tommy Jarvis, psychologically transforms into Jason Voorhees. So it's this idea that I find that really fascinating, because when we take the kind of traditional narrative structure of the slasher and just swap out a male hero for a female heroine, it doesn't seem to work for some reason. That there's something, and that's why I find studying these films from a psychological perspective really fascinating, that they're the product of a specific time and place, and they reflect the values and the social mores of that period, but there's something much deeper going on here than just, a psycho running around killing a bunch of sexually adventurous young people. And so I think that there's something to be said about the kind of gender dynamics that are at play within these films, and how that relationship, that dynamic between the protagonist and the villain operates when you have a masculine protagonist versus a feminine protagonist, and how that functions. Also, in terms of the sort of postmodern horror film, it's really fascinating because in the case of Scream, yes, it's questioning, criticizing the conventions of the traditional slasher film, but it's also reinforcing them at the same time. So it's that kind of dynamic where it's criticizing the misogyny and the patriarchal values that these films tend to display, and yet at the same time it's reinforcing those exact same values. So that's kind of the problem, I would say, with postmodernism in general, is that it toys with these conventions, it plays with them, but it doesn't actually break them because it can't. There are certain narratological elements that have to be present, and as much as it tries to get away from them, at the end of the day, inevitably it tends to reinforce them, at least from my perspective. And so that's something I was really curious about with Charlotte Baker's, with your presentation, was that this idea of bringing in diversity and really starting to question those narratological perspectives, will that actually break the subgenre itself? Will that actually start to pick apart and pull apart the very narratological structure of the slasher itself? I know that was really long-winded. Sorry about that.
No, it's great.
Yeah, I just have one final thing to add, going back to what Kevin opened with whenever you mentioned how the male survivors kind of are becoming the murderer as opposed to combating him. I'm going to bring up my first thought, which was, I think, Texas Chainsaw 3D. I'm sorry, this is a divisive film to bring up, and I know a lot of people have opinions about whether they love or hate it, but we see the final girl here, and she, one of the first things she does is have sex with her boyfriend, but she is our final girl. However, towards the end of the film, we do see her kind of siding with, the motives of, I guess, her relation with the killer. So I kind of see that the more, as the years go by, we start to get a bit more self-aware of how the final girl is supposed to look to us, who she is, how she feels, and how the viewer feels when they're watching her. And so that was just the one detail I'd like to add to that.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, go, Kevin.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that's a great point. I absolutely agree with that.
Jacqueline, there were a few questions from the beginning that I'll give them a couple of them to you, and then you can sort of pick which one you're most interested in. Zachary says the idea of virginity as commodity brings the idea of class status. Does the final girl then inhabit a higher class status than the other women in slashers? And then Michaela says, a question for Jacqueline: when you said a girl who can't be fucked, excuse my French, is killed, it reminds me of incel discourse. So is the slasher then a sort of kind of pre-incel?
Those are both really fascinating questions, and I really would love to comment on Michaela and her questions. So this is an excellent question, and I really like to share with my students the ideology of the incels, the rage of the incels, and how they kind of exist as their own microculture. And we see that it's this very confusing loop of hating women because they do not want to be with you because you hate them. And so on and on it goes. And we kind of absolutely see this reflected, I guess, in the examples I gave, probably, especially Laurie Strode and Michael Myers. Nothing can be done regarding their sexual relationship. One maintains her virginity. The other simply cannot be with her. They're fated lovers. So what he's going to do is try to kill her. However, he's going to hurt everybody around her in the process to traumatize her. So she almost can wish she's dead as she, gets older. So I think that's a fantastic question. And there's my response to that.
Good. Let's see. I think this sort of came up a little bit already, but maybe we want to talk about it some more. Paul Oxbury asks, with the societal shift, which came up right in your presentations, with the societal shift towards acceptance of premarital sex, how does this impact the trope, or indeed, why does it look like it hasn't impacted the trope? And that's for anyone.
Oh, sure. Do you mind if I can throw out an answer? I think that's a really fascinating point, and it sort of goes back to what I was mentioning earlier about postmodernism, that it questions these conventions, but at the end of the day, ultimately reinforces them. Because I think that, although I entirely agree with Jacqueline's point that virginity is used as a tool essentially to articulate misogynistic tendencies within the slasher subgenre, I would add to that there is something else going on as well at the same time, which is that the virginity of the protagonist, the female protagonist, also allows her to subvert and sublimate those sexual impulses into violence, which none of the other female characters in these films generally can do. And that component is present even in postmodern films that purport to question and challenge the virginity of the heroine. And so what I would say is that that notion, that ability to sublimate sexual impulses into violence, is a component that needs to be present. Even if the heroine is not necessarily a virgin or chaste, I think that that is an elemental component of her character. And so I think that's why a lot of postmodern horror films aren't able to completely rid themselves of that notion of the heroine as the virginal female, because that ability to sublimate those sexual impulses into basically going into attack mode is so elemental to the narrative structure of the overall film. That would be my 2 cents on the matter. But how to then divorce those two concepts, I think, would require really some genius storytelling.
Yeah, good. Charlotte, maybe a version of what we've been talking about. Victoria just asked, as time goes on, audience expectation. So what can be changed about The Final Girl?
I think it's happening. I think there's an element of, again, to do with the intertextuality. I think that our knowledge of what The Final Girl is, you come to these programs knowing that, having that knowledge. And I think it's how those texts play with it that engages us. And that ultimately then impacts our understanding of these characters and women more broadly, I think, sometimes as well. In terms of where we're going with it, I think you've had slashers really good for providing so many different understandings of women and of final girls. In season 2, there's an episode with Renee, who is in a relationship with, she's a lesbian and she's married to a gay man, and there is no kind of romantic subtext to it, but they're married and there's no need to explain, and they're really, really happy. And all of a sudden we have this, she is built in some ways as a final girl, and Ian Carpenter, who I interviewed, also acknowledged that she was, meant to be framed in that way. And all of a sudden she has this, something happens and she loses her partner, and her whole world falls down. And again, it very much plays into the traditional understanding of the final girl, very much the, Texas Chainsaw Massacre kind of lose that kind of mental stability in that moment of grief and of everything else. But the way in which it's built up, and the way in which she's, in so many ways, she's not what we'd normally understand as a final girl, but her representation and the way in which her story is explored, I've never seen on screen before. And to me, that was, absolutely brand new. I was absolutely amazed in the way that story was constructed. But alongside her story, you've also got various other final girls. Dawn, for example, who's incredibly abrupt and not overly nice at all, and in many ways doesn't really allow identification until the very few episodes. Again, these kind of understandings of our final girl are not what we'd expect, in terms of what our previous knowledge is. I hope that answers the question.
I'm conscious of time, so I think we will wrap up here. That was a really spectacular panel, and really great to have a long discussion about, identification and subjectivity, because it's something that keeps coming up all along this conference, and yet it isn't necessarily something that's been discussed yet and interrogated. So it's really great to have that involvement. So thank you to our speakers, Charlotte, Kevin and Jacqueline, and thank you to Eric for being a fantastic chair